The summer before I came here to be with you all at St. Paul's, I was working at a church called Holy Comforter in Atlanta. Now, Holy Comforter is mostly made up of folks who live with various mental illnesses. Now, unfortunately, because of their mental illnesses, many of the members of Holy Comforter were left very vulnerable. And so several of them lived in subpar housing. So they weren't really cared for very well. This meant they often had old, rarely washed clothes. And I saw many of them with shoes that looked like they were right on the edge of falling apart. Now, Holy Comforter was great about providing care and activities for these members throughout the week. And every so often, there would be a clothes drive for those who didn't have decent clothes. And also, there would be a foot clinic. And I remember one of the members who took advantage of this quite vividly. We'll call him Joe. Joe lived within about a mile or so of the church. And so while we had a van that would come and pick people up from their various homes nearby us, occasionally he would get kind of fidgety in the morning and would go ahead and come and walk to the church before we had a chance to drive the van to him. So this would happen several times, maybe during the month, maybe during the week, that I would see him out walking to and from the church. And his shoes were about the most worn down of the folks that I can remember over at Holy Comforter. And his socks, in fact, the only time I think I remember ever seeing him wear clean socks was when one of the volunteers that week handed him new ones. And then there were his feet themselves. He rarely got his toenails cut, so they would have that slight curve as they were beginning to curve around his toes. The rest of his feet looked battered, bruised, and broken. Honestly, I'm not certain how he was able to even get to church half the days that he walked over. Sometimes I think it might have been a sheer force of will that allowed him to make the journey. So with all of this, his feet were quite difficult to look at. And yet, for these foot clinics that Holy Comforter would put on, at these clinics I would see trained nurses and sometimes trained physicians who would carefully take off his shoes and take off his socks, clip his toenails, and very carefully massage his feet. Looking at an event like this, you can only think, my goodness, what sort of love do these people have to take on the task of even touching these really disgusting, broken feet? What kind of love does it take to massage these sorts of feet for a stranger? This is a great act of kindness that those of the foot clinic performed at Holy Comforter. And the name of our service tonight has to do with such an act of kindness. Maundy means mandate or command. Just as Jesus gives his disciples in our reading a new commandment. This is where the name for our evening comes from, this new commandment. The commandment Jesus gives that just as I have loved you, you should love one another. This commandment is placed in the gospel right after Jesus washes his own disciples' feet. And that's because this action shows just how much love Jesus had for his disciples. Because in ancient times, a good host would provide water for his guests to wash their feet. Because unlike us, back in those times, people didn't have closed-toed shoes. So there was nothing to keep the dust and elements from sticking on to almost every pore on these people's feet. And the soles of their sandals wouldn't have been particularly very comfortable, not quite like the modern rubberized soles that we all have for our own shoes. And so all of these things make me often wonder if the disciples' feet weren't that much unlike the feet of Joe. If they weren't just as battered, bruised, and broken as Joe's was. And also notice with the hosts in ancient times that they only needed to provide the water. Just as we shy away from feet in this day and age, so people shied away from feet in ancient times. Because they were dirty and gross. So dirty and gross that not even servants were required to actually wash them. So what Jesus is doing is an act that not even most servants would perform. It was an act of love and self-giving for Jesus to stoop so low, to take care of the most vulnerable and dirty part of the human body. It was an act of love that is only surpassed by Jesus humbling himself for all of humanity and dying on the cross to save us all from our sins. And then when Jesus is finished washing his disciples' feet, he calls them to do the same, to follow his own example as they go out into the world, for them to wash each other's feet. Jesus is calling the disciples to follow his example and serve others with the same love that he showed to them. The love of one who would stoop himself down to wash the feet of those who, by all accounts, should be serving him. The love of one who would rather humble himself and take care of the needs of those around him. The love of one who would die for his friends. Like the disciples, we too are called to emulate the love Jesus has for us in the world. We are called to get down in the nitty-gritty of it all, to show others that we really care about them. And sometimes we're called to put aside our own lives as a sacrifice to help others. We are called to love with the same love of the one who washed his own servants' feet, the one who died for you and for me. That is the command given for us, to follow this night and to follow forevermore.